The drawer had been locked for 23 years. It sat in the corner of the old nursery at Ashvale Park, beneath a window that looked out onto the November kitchen gardens, and no one in the household had remarked upon it for so long that the servants had ceased to see it entirely. The nursery itself was out of fashion, used now only for storage. Its rocking horse turned to face the wall as though it had done something to deserve the exile. The drawer was iron-cornered and small, set into the base of a battered cabinet that had once held linen squares and wooden blocks, and its keyhole was dark with age. It held no particular mystery, or so the household maintained. It was simply locked, and the key was lost, and such things happened in old houses. Dorothea Fairweather had not known the drawer existed until the morning of her father's burial. She had come to Ashvale Park as a companion to the Dowager Countess of Ashvale, which was to say she had come as a woman who carried shawls, read correspondence aloud when the Countess's eyes were tired, and arranged flowers in rooms the Countess subsequently did not enter. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a country solicitor dead of a sudden fever the previous spring, and she held her situation with both hands because there was nothing else to hold. The Countess was not unkind, precisely. She was thorough. She noticed everything Dorothea did well and filed it without comment. And she noticed everything Dorothea did imperfectly and corrected it with a precision that left no room for argument. Dorothea had been at Ashvale Park for 3 months when the old Earl died, and she had understood, in the way a woman in service learns to understand such things, that the new Earl's arrival would change everything. She had not understood how much. The village of Ashvale had decided, by the time Dorothea had been there a fortnight, that she was a very quiet sort of woman. This was the phrase Mrs. Portman, the housekeeper, used to the under-butler, and it filtered upward to the Dowager Countess's ears within the week. A very quiet sort of woman, they said, as though quiet were a condition rather than a choice, as though stillness were the same thing as absence. Dorothea heard it once, through a door she had not known was ajar, and she had kept walking, because there was nothing to be gained by stopping. The words settled into her chest alongside the other things she carried there. Her father's handwriting, the sound of his study door in the evenings, the particular quality of the light in his sitting room that she would not see again. She was at her writing table in the housekeeper's sitting room, copying a letter for the Countess, when Mrs. Portman appeared in the doorway and said, in a voice stripped of its usual efficiency, that the new Earl had arrived. Dorothea had set her pen aside before Mrs. Portman finished the sentence. She had understood, from the moment of the old Earl's death, that this was the hinge of things. A new Earl meant a new domestic order, new expectations of every person in the household, and for a companion, specifically, a new estimation of whether she was worth the keeping. She had spent the intervening days doing her work with additional care, which was the only form of argument available to her. His name was Edmund Quayle, Earl of Ashvale. He was 36 years old, and he had been abroad for the better part of a decade, and the servants who had known him as a young man spoke of him with a carefulness that told Dorothea more than their words did. He had left England shortly after his wife's death. He had not come home since. He had written to his mother with regularity and with a concision that the Countess described, to Dorothea, as characteristic. She said the word with the affection of someone who had long since stopped expecting it to change. Dorothea had formed a picture of a man organized entirely around absence, and she was not wrong about this, though she was wrong about what the absence meant. Dorothea did not meet him the first day. She arranged his mother's letters for the afternoon and kept to the household's rhythm and told herself, in the firm way she had learned to tell herself things, that the Earl's arrival was a fact and not an event, and that she had no particular role in whatever followed. She met him on the second morning in the library, where she had gone to return a volume of botanical illustrations the Countess had finished with. The library at Ashvale Park was a long room with windows onto the kitchen court and shelves floor to ceiling on the opposing wall, and it smelled of leather and cold coal, because no one had thought to light the fire, and she had paused in the doorway to let her eyes adjust from the brighter corridor. He was standing at the window with his back to the room, and the light came in behind him, gray and flat and cold. And when he turned, it was with the kind of attention that felt less like a glance and more like a measurement. He was tall and lean with the weather in his face, a man who had spent years in a climate harder than England's, and his dark hair was shot through at the temples with silver that surprised her. His coat was navy, well-fitted and slightly worn at the cuffs, the coat of a man who traveled rather than attended. His hands were at his sides, and she noticed them because they were still, as everything about him was still. The stillness of a man who had taught himself economy a long time ago, and found it suited him. His eyes were a color she could not immediately name, some northern thing between green and gray, and they stayed on her face for precisely the length of time needed to make clear that he had decided, deliberately, to hold the look. "You are my mother's companion," he said. It was not a question. "I am, my lord," she said. "She speaks well of you." He said this without any particular inflection, a fact reported rather than a compliment offered, and then he returned his attention to the window. She replaced the book and left. She thought, as she walked back toward the Countess's rooms, that she had never been looked at quite that way. Not by anyone who had subsequently looked away, not by anyone who had then said something so level and ungarnished as that, as though speaking well were a simply established condition, as obvious as the fact of gray light or cold coal, requiring no decoration to make it true. If you have ever waited for something you cannot name, you will understand what follows. Stay with her. The will was read on the 4th day after the funeral, in the library, with the family solicitor and the Countess, and Edmund and 2 distant male cousins present. Dorothea was not present. She was upstairs, in the corridor outside the nursery, because the Countess had asked her to find a particular watercolor that was believed to be somewhere in the old schoolroom, and Dorothea had gone methodically through the boxes and the stacked canvases until she reached the battered cabinet in the corner. The drawer was locked. She would not have thought twice about it, except that when she knelt to examine the cabinet, she noticed that the wood around the keyhole had been scored, long ago, by something that had tried to force it open and failed. The score marks were old, darker than the rest of the wood, worn smooth with years so that they were more texture than damage now, a record of some earlier urgency that the house had absorbed and forgotten. Someone had tried very hard to open this drawer, and then stopped. Or been stopped. She ran her forefinger along the longest score, and thought of all the questions one could not ask in a house where one was employed. She thought of what a woman's hands might look like. Trying to open a drawer that had something inside it she needed. She left it and found the watercolor and brought it downstairs, and she did not mention the drawer to anyone. She thought of it in the evening, while she read aloud to the Countess. And she measured the Countess's face at the moments when she was not being observed. And she found there something she had not previously identified. It was not grief exactly, but the specific settled quality of a woman who has lived for a very long time alongside something she did not choose and cannot undo, and has arranged herself accordingly. The will, it emerged, left Ashvale Park and its estate to Edmund in the expected way. The distant cousins received small bequests and departed before dinner. The Countess said nothing at supper, which was itself a form of speech. And Edmund watched his mother across the table with the careful patience of a man who understood that whatever she was not saying would eventually be said. Dorothea sat at the lower end of the table, where companions sat, and she watched Edmund Quayle across the length of his inheritance, and thought that he looked exactly like a man carrying something he had carried for so long that he no longer noticed its weight. He noticed her noticing. He gave no sign of it except the quality of his stillness, which changed very slightly, the way a fire changes when someone enters the room. She looked away. First, it was the Countess who mentioned the nursery cabinet. 3 days later, in a way that was not quite casual, she said to the room in general that she had been meaning for years to have the old nursery cleared properly, and that the locked drawer in that dreadful cabinet had always annoyed her, and that the key was lost and had been lost since before Edmund was born, and that she supposed they would simply have to have it forced eventually. She said all of this while examining her embroidery, and she did not look at her son. Edmund said nothing. But that evening, Dorothea returned to the nursery for no reason she could have defended, and found the door to the old cabinet standing open. Edmund was crouched before it, both hands flat on his thighs, looking at what was inside. She stopped in the doorway. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his face was doing something she had not seen it do before, something that was neither the controlled attention of the library nor the careful patience of the dinner table. It was the face of a man who had found what he had not been looking for, and did not yet know what to do with the finding. "Come in," he said. His voice was level. "Miss Fairweather." She crossed the room and looked into the drawer. There were letters inside, a bundle of them tied with brown ribbon that had faded to no particular color. The top letter bore a date 23 years prior, and a name she did not know. Not Edmund's name, not the old Earl's, but a woman's name, written in a hand that shook slightly, as though the writer had been afraid. "Do you know that name?" he asked. "No, my lord." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Her name was Eleanor Quayle. She was my father's first wife." He paused. "She died before my parents' marriage. That is what I was always told." The cold in the nursery was the particular cold of rooms that no one heats, and Dorothea felt it at her wrists and in the place between her shoulder blades, but she did not move from where she was standing. "And the letters?" "I have not yet opened them." He looked at her, and the thing in his face was still there, rawer now. "I find I am not willing to open them alone." She understood then that this was not a request for company. It was something more than that, and something more dangerous. And she understood also that he had not intended it to be, that it had come out of him before his discipline could prevent it. He was 36 years old, and he had buried a wife and a father and an entire decade of his life. And he was crouching in a cold nursery in the house he had not been able to come home to, and the only person he had asked to stay was her. "Then I will stay," she said. She sat down on the old rocking horse's footboard, which was the only flat surface at the right height, and he remained crouched on the floor, and they opened the first letter together, which is to say he unfolded it and read it aloud in a voice that did not change its register, not once, though the contents warranted it. Eleanor Quayle had not died. She had been sent away. She had been sent away in the autumn of what would have been her first season as the Earl's wife, and the reason she had been sent away was that she was increasing, and the child she carried was legitimate, and the old Earl's brother had made arrangements with a family in Shropshire, and paid the doctor, and sealed the letters, and locked the drawer, and told the household that Eleanor had been taken by fever, and the old Earl had married again within 6 months, and Edmund had been born the following year, and the heir of Ashvale had been a fiction for 23 years. The last letter in the bundle was from a parish register, a baptism entry for a child named Thomas Hugh Quayle, born to Eleanor Quayle, legitimate wife of the late Earl, in the spring 22 years past. There was an address in Shropshire. Edmund sat back on his heels and said nothing. Dorothea watched the side of his face in the cold gray light from the nursery window, the jaw that she had already thought of as carved from something structural, and she felt the magnitude of what the drawer had given him and the equal magnitude of what it had taken. He was an earl. He was also a man who had just been handed evidence that he might be neither the firstborn nor the heir, and he was sitting very still, the way a person sits when they are deciding what kind of man they are going to be. "You did not know," she said. Not a question, not an absolution, simply the truth of what she had just witnessed. "No," he said. "I did not know." He folded the letters very precisely, with the care of someone who knows that a thing once unfolded cannot be folded back into what it was. "I shall have to go to Shropshire." She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. He looked at her then, directly, with the full weight of those gray-green eyes, and she felt it in her sternum, the way one feels a bell when one stands too close to its tower. "I shall want someone to travel with my mother," he said, "if she is willing to come." This was the thing she had not expected. His first thought was his mother's comfort, that even here, at the precise moment of his own unraveling, he was thinking about who else was going to need steadying. Something shifted in her chest that she did not have a name for yet. She told herself she did not have a name for it. The journey to Shropshire took 3 days, and the Dowager Countess was not well for 2 of them. She had been told, carefully, by Edmund, in the library, with the door closed, and Dorothea waiting in the hall, with her hands folded and her heart loud in her ears. The Countess had not cried. She had asked to see the letters. She had read them in order, and then she had sat for a long time with her embroidery in her lap, not touching it. And then she had said, in a voice from which everything unnecessary had been removed, that they would go to Shropshire. Dorothea had admired her, in that moment, more than she had expected to admire anyone again. The carriage was close and cold, and Dorothea sat opposite the Countess with a rug across the older woman's knees, and read aloud from a volume of sermons because the Countess found them settling, though she never said so. Dorothea had learned, in 3 months of service, to read the Countess's silence as a kind of agreement. The absence of correction was approval, and the slight forward incline of the head meant continue, and the occasional closing of the eyes did not mean sleep, but a more complete attention. She read carefully, with the enunciation she had been taught by her father, and had never found reason to abandon. Edmund rode alongside the carriage for the first day, and sat inside for the second, when the weather turned, and he sat across from Dorothea with his long legs arranged at an angle to avoid her skirts. And the proximity was different from proximity in a room, because in a room one could retreat, and in a carriage there was nowhere to go. She was aware of him the way one is aware of a fire in a cold space, not looking at it directly, but registering its presence at the edge of every other sensation. When the road pitched and she reached for the strap, his hand was briefly at her elbow, steadying, and then gone before she had completed the reaching. And she did not thank him because it was already past, and thanks would only have made it an event when he had clearly intended it as nothing. This was the command as protection she had been observing in smaller forms for weeks. She understood it better in the carriage than she had in the house. It was not coldness. It was the opposite of coldness. It was the action of a man who could not yet trust himself to say the thing, and so did it in the only register available to him, The small physical fact, the quietly accomplished thing. The very quiet sort of woman, Dorothea reminded herself. That was what the household said. A very quiet sort of woman, useful for carrying things and reading aloud and not being particularly visible. She kept her hand still in her lap and her eyes on the road beyond the window. Edmund said on the second afternoon, "You were a solicitor's daughter." "I was," she said. "Then you understand what the register entry means." "I understand what it means if it is genuine." He considered that. "And if it is genuine?" "Then you are the second son," she said. Because there was no gentle way to say it, and she had long since decided that gentleness for its own sake was a form of discourtesy. "And Thomas Hugh Quayle is the Earl of Ashvale." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." And she had the strange experience of watching a man sit quietly with the loss of everything he owned and find that the sitting was, somehow, not beyond him. She thought that she had never met anyone like him. She told herself she had never met anyone. Full stop. You have been a companion and a solicitor's daughter and a woman who carries shawls, and you know very little about what kind of men exist in the world. But she watched him from the corner of her eye all the same. If there is someone in your own life who has carried something without complaint, you will know precisely what I mean. Leave a word for her, if you stay. The house in Shropshire was modest and clean, the house of a family that had managed carefully and without pretension, and the woman who answered the door was perhaps 50 years old, with eyes that were the same gray-green as the man standing on her step. The young man was 22 years old and employed as a land agent for a local estate, and had been told, 3 months before, by his mother on her deathbed, that his father was an earl. He had not known what to do with the information. He had written a letter to Ashvale Park, tentatively, and the letter had not been answered, because the old earl had died the week it arrived, and the household was in disorder. He had the letter still, unsent in its second attempt, on the table in the sitting room where they all gathered, uncomfortable with the weight of what they were doing and doing it anyway. He was a quiet young man with his mother's features and his father's height, and he had changed his coat for their arrival, she noticed, and cleaned his boots, which were good boots though not fashionable. The boots of a man who spent most of his time out of doors doing something practical. He had the hands of a land agent, strong and rough-knuckled, and he kept them flat on the table as though to prevent them from betraying him. He looked at Edmund across the table with an expression that was half terror and half something Dorothea could only describe as recognition, the look of someone who has been told about a place they have never been but find, on arrival, that they already know its shape. He was afraid. He was not going to show it any more than he was already showing it. She thought that this, too, was the Quayle inheritance. Edmund looked back at him the same way. The Shropshire woman who had answered the door had looked at the Countess in her traveling dress and allowed a fractional pause before admitting them. A very quiet sort of woman, Dorothea reminded herself. Perhaps, or perhaps a woman who had learned to read the fractional pause, which was not quiet at all. The pause had said, in its way, that she knew what a countess was, and what it meant that one had appeared on her step, and that she was not certain the world she had arranged for herself would survive the afternoon. And then the woman had stepped back and opened the door wider, which was its own kind of courage. The Countess sat between Edmund and Thomas with her hands folded in her lap, and said, after a long silence, that Thomas had his grandfather's ears, which had been an unfortunate inheritance in that family for 5 generations, and that she hoped he had managed otherwise. Thomas had blinked, and then, unexpectedly, he had smiled, and the smile was his grandmother's smile, which was to say it was sudden and uncalculable and entirely genuine, and the Dowager Countess of Ashvale had made a small sound that was not quite a word, and reached across the table and put her hand over his. Dorothea looked away because the moment was not hers, but she felt Edmund looking at her from across the room. And when she looked back, he was not looking away. The arrangements that followed took 6 weeks, and the considerable attention of 2 solicitors and a King's Bench barrister who drove up from London in a very cold January. The documents were examined. The parish register was authenticated. A witness was found. The old doctor in his 80s, living in a village outside Ludlow, who had attended the birth and had spent 22 years with the knowledge of it sealed inside him, like a stone inside a fruit, waiting for exactly this kind of pressure to split it open. He gave his account with the careful precision of a man who has memorized a thing too important to misremember. And when the barrister had finished with him, the old man sat for a moment with his hands on his knees and said that he was glad. Edmund was present for all of it. He sat in rooms where men discussed the unmaking of his identity with the same careful attention he had given the letters in the nursery. And he did not flinch. And he did not argue. And he did not once attempt to cast doubt on the evidence. Dorothea observed this because she was present as the Countess's companion. And the observing was what she was there to do. And she told herself this. She was not there to notice the way he moved through a room, the particular economy of it. Nothing wasted, no gesture uncertain. She was not there to notice that when her shawl slipped from her shoulder in the Ludlow solicitor's office, he crossed the room without appearing to decide to cross it and settled the shawl back before she had completed the motion of reaching for it herself, and then withdrew as though nothing had happened. She was not there to notice that his voice, when he spoke to her directly, was different from his voice when he spoke to the solicitors, a shade quieter, a shade more careful. The voice of a man choosing his words the way one chooses the path across uncertain ground. She told herself all of this. She was not persuaded. He found her one afternoon in the sitting room of the inn, where they were lodging for the duration of the legal proceedings, copying a letter for his mother, the fire at her left side throwing warm light across the page. She heard him pause in the doorway before she heard him enter. "Miss Fairweather," he said. "My lord," she said, and then stopped, because they had both noticed simultaneously that the address was wrong, would be wrong for another 3 weeks until the official recognition. That he was currently neither Lord nor Mr. in any clean legal sense, and the absurdity of it was brief and acute, and she saw something that was almost amusement cross his face. "Edmund," he said, "for the moment, perhaps." Her pen hovered. "That would not be appropriate." "No," he agreed, "it would not." He came into the room and stood at the fireplace and looked at the flames, and not at her. "My mother is asleep?" "She is. She was tired after this morning." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She has not asked me once how I feel about this." "No," Dorothea said. "You have not either." She considered the page in front of her. She set the pen down. "I assumed you would tell me if you wished to." He looked at her then, and the firelight was on the left side of his face, the winter light from the window on the right. And he was both things at once, warmth and cold. And she felt the pulse at her wrists in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "My first wife," he said. His voice did not alter. "Her name was Grace. She died of childbed fever. The child also." He paused. She had told me the evening before that she thought the child might come early. I was at a dinner, and I did not come home when the message was sent. By the time I arrived, both of them were gone. The fire crackled. Outside, the January wind moved along the eaves of the inn. I came home from that dinner, he said, believing I was a man of fixed habits and clear responsibilities, and I left it something else entirely. I have not been entirely sure what since. He looked back at the fire. And now I am not even an earl. That is not why you came home, Dorothea said. No, he said. It is not. You came home because your father died, and your mother needed you. And a drawer in the old nursery needed opening. His mouth moved very slightly in that direction that was not quite a smile. You make it sound simple. It is not simple, she said. But it is clear. He looked at her with the full attention of those gray-green eyes, and this time he did not perform the civility of looking away. You are the clearest person I have met in a very long time, Miss Fairweather. She felt the warmth of that land in her chest and flatten into something complicated. She picked up her pen. You should rest, my lord. The barrister is here again tomorrow morning. Edmund, he said quietly, and left. She sat for a long time at the writing table without writing anything. The fire had settled into its long burning phase, the coals low and steady, and the room smelled of tallow and damp wool and the particular cold that seeps under indoors in January. She thought about Grace, whom she had not known and would never know, dead at the moment of producing the thing a quail wife was required to produce. And she thought about Edmund arriving home too late, and she thought about what it would do to a man's internal architecture to carry that knowledge for a decade without putting it down. She had not told him anything useful. She had only told him that his not knowing was not knowing. She had stayed, which was what he had asked of her, and which was perhaps the same thing as useful, in the end. She picked up her pen. She did not write the letter she was supposed to be writing. She wrote instead a single sentence in the margin of the page, which she crossed out immediately, and which read, in her own cramped hand, that she believed he was a good man. The letters remained in Edmund's keeping throughout. He had not been required to produce them until the second week of the proceedings, and when the solicitor had reached for them, Edmund had held the bundle for one moment before releasing it, with the precise care of a man surrendering something he knows he should not wish to keep. Dorothea watched this from her chair against the wall, and thought she had found it at last. The thing at the center of him. The dead wife, and the lost child, and the decade abroad, and the inheritance he is about to return to a brother. He did not know he had. And underneath all of it, still intact, the understanding that the right thing and the wanted thing are rarely the same, and that this does not excuse one from the right thing. She had been telling herself for 6 weeks that what she felt was admiration. She had been wrong about the word. She knew she had been wrong about the word on the morning the recognition was formally confirmed, when the barrister announced in the quiet sitting room that Thomas was the rightful Earl of Ashvale, and Edmund received the announcement with the same stillness he had given the nursery drawer, and the only thing that changed was that his eyes moved, briefly, to find hers. She was the person he looked at, in that moment. Not his mother, not the barrister, not Thomas, who was going pale and breathing carefully at the far end of the table. Her. And she felt it go through her like a bell struck close, like a thing that had been building since the library on the second morning, and she could not look away from him, and she did not try. The Dowager Countess arranged everything that came next. It was her great gift, arrangement, and she applied it now with the particular force of a woman who has absorbed a shock, and decided that the world is still required to proceed in an orderly fashion. Thomas was to come to Ashvale Park. Thomas was to be introduced to the household and the tenants. There would be a dinner in the spring, when the roads were better, to which the neighboring families would be invited, and Thomas would be presented not as a surprise, but as a long-awaited arrival, a son of the family restored, which was both the true version and the kinder one. Edmund would remain at Ashvale, for the time being, as Thomas's uncle, which was what he now was, in point of law, and which sat on him with a grace that Dorothea found she could not stop watching. She should have returned to London, or to some other employment. She said this to the Countess in early March, when the roads had dried, and the household was preparing for Thomas's arrival. She said it with her eyes on the garden outside the window, and her hands quiet in her lap, and the terrible calm of a woman who knows she is about to do the sensible thing. The Countess looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Edmund has spoken to me." Dorothea's hands stilled further. "He spoke to me," the Countess said, with the precision she brought to all matters of significance. "About a woman he described as clear. It was the word he used. He said he had not met anyone clear in a very long time, and that he had been trying to determine, for some months, whether it would be an imposition to ask such a person, whether she might consent to speak plainly with him on a regular basis." The Countess paused. "He is not a man who asks for things easily." "No," Dorothea said. "I told him that if he could not ask the question more directly than that, he was going to lose the only opportunity he had, and that he had better find her and say what he meant before she made arrangements to be somewhere else." Dorothea stood up and put her shawl on, and went out into the garden. He was there. Of course he was there. He was standing at the end of the rose arbor, which was bare in March, all cane and spine and the promise of what it would be in summer. And the light was that particular March light that is not quite winter and not yet spring, pale and clean and without warmth. He turned when he heard her step on the gravel, and she stopped walking, some 3 yards from him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He was wearing the navy coat, slightly worn at the cuffs, and his hands were not at his sides. They were together in front of him, not quite clasped, the posture of a man who has prepared for something and is discovering, at the moment of its arrival, that he is not prepared correctly. She understood then that he was afraid. He was actually afraid. The man who had sat in a Shropshire sitting room and looked at the evidence of his own replacement with more dignity than she could have managed, who had ridden beside the carriage in the January wind and never once asked to be thanked for what he was doing, was standing in a cold March garden afraid of her answer. She had not known, until that moment, the full extent of what she felt. The thing in his face was entirely unguarded. For once, no careful stillness, no measured attention, just the man himself, 36 years old and twice bereaved and uncertain in a way that he had never, in all her observation of him, permitted himself to be uncertain. "Miss Fairweather," he said. "You spoke to your mother," she said. "I did." He turned toward her fully. "I have been practicing what to say. I am, it emerges, not very good at it." "Then say it imperfectly." He took a breath, and she watched his chest rise with it, and she felt her own breath suspend, the way one holds a note before the music resolves. "I am not an earl," he said. "I am a second son. I have no estate and no particular income, and a very great deal of history that I should warn you about if I had any experience of warning people about things, which I do not." He stopped. He looked at her hands, and then at her face. "I would like to ask you whether you would be willing to continue speaking plainly with me, on a permanent basis." She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of her own heartbeat in the manner of someone who has not thought about their heartbeat in years, the particular insistent fact of it, the body insisting on being noticed. The March light was thin, and the rose arbor was all its bones, and somewhere inside the house a door opened and closed, and she thought about what she had been carrying. Her father's death, her reduced circumstances, the careful management of her own expectations, and the word she had been using for 6 months, admiration, and the understanding, arriving now, that the word had been wrong. She had been wrong about the word. "Yes," she said. He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, which was not much distance, and he took her face in both his hands. Gloved hands, warm through the leather. And he looked at her the way he had looked at the nursery drawer the night it finally gave way to him, with the full weight of someone who has found what they had stopped expecting to find. "Dorothea," he said, and it was the first time, her given name in his voice, and it landed exactly as a first time should, with the particular gravity of something spoken once and meaning to be spoken always. He kissed her very softly, with the deliberateness of a man who has learned that what one does gently, one does for keeps, and she felt the warmth of it in her chest, where the cold March air had been, and the world around them was winter and bare cane, and the cold smell of damp earth working its way into readiness, and it was entirely sufficient. The dinner in May was smaller than it might have been, by common agreement. Thomas sat at the head of the table at Ashvale Park for the first time, with his grandmother at his right hand and Edmund at his left, and he held himself with the particular straightness of a young man who is discovering, slowly and with great effort, that the thing he has been handed might actually be his to carry. He had a land agent's hands and a countess's smile and a father he had never met, and Dorothea watched him from her place at the table and thought that he would, in time, be exactly adequate to everything that was required of him. Edmund had moved to a smaller house on the estate's edge, a sensible house with a good library and a kitchen garden and a view of the main house's chimneys through a stand of elms. He had gone there without drama, organizing the removal himself, and declining offers of assistance with the quiet economy of a man who has learned to need less than he was given. The library he had stocked over the following weeks from Ashvale's surplus shelves, Thomas having generously said he had no use for half of them, and the kitchen garden he had left largely alone, because it was February when he moved in, and February was no time for ambitious cultivation. He had asked Dorothea, on the morning after the dinner, whether she would walk with him. She had said yes before he finished the question. They walked the path between the smaller house and the main gates in the May morning, with the light coming in long and golden through the elm stand, and he talked about the kitchen garden and the library and the house's one significant defect, which was that the morning room faced west and therefore missed the early light, and she listened to all of it with her hand in the crook of his arm and the understanding between them like a warm weight, settled. She had given her notice to the Countess in April. The Countess had received it with her embroidery in her lap and her eyes on the garden, and a small pause before she said that she had expected this and that she was glad, and that if Dorothea did not visit regularly, she would have words with Edmund, who was entirely responsible. Dorothea had agreed to visit regularly and had kissed the Countess's cheek, which was not customary, and which the Countess endured with a dignity that was itself a form of welcome. The banns were read in the village church in April, and the wedding was quiet and deliberate as everything Edmund did, with Thomas and the Countess and Mrs. Portman and the old doctor from Ludlow, who had driven a very long way, and wept thoroughly, and was entirely unembarrassed by it. By June, the kitchen garden was planted. Edmund had been wrong about February being no time for ambition, Dorothea decided. It was exactly the time One planted things in the cold and trusted the ground and waited with patient attention, and the earth, which had its own kind of discipline, did the rest. The letters from the old nursery drawer were kept in a cedar box in the smaller house's library, on the second shelf from the left, beside the window that looked out onto the elms. Thomas had asked early on whether Edmund wished to keep them, and Edmund had said yes, without explanation. And Thomas had nodded as though this were entirely sensible, which it was. Dorothea found Edmund at that shelf one morning in the first autumn of their marriage, standing with the box in his hands, not opening it, just holding it the way one holds a thing whose weight one has finally made peace with. He set it back on the shelf when she entered, and turned and looked at her with the whole of his face. No careful stillness, no measured attention. Just that uncalculated directness she had been observing since the library on the second morning, and would, she understood now, be observing for the rest of her considerable life. "The ground squirrel has found the kitchen garden," he said. "I thought you should know." She laughed. It was not a usual laugh, not the restrained variety she had produced in other people's houses. It was the full, unguarded kind, and it surprised them both, and he smiled in return. The sudden, uncalculated smile she had first seen in Thomas's face, and now understood was the Quayle inheritance, generation after generation of them, opening like that. She crossed the room and took the cedar box from the shelf herself, and held it for a moment, feeling its weight. And then she looked at him. "It is a good story," she said. "It is a difficult story," he said. "Those are the same thing," she said. "When they end well." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray-green eyes in the autumn light from the window that missed the early sun, and then he put his hand over hers, where she held the box, warm and certain and entirely without qualifier. And they stood there together while the October light moved across the shelf of books, and the elm stand beyond the glass went gold, and the kitchen garden below the window stood full of everything that had been planted in the cold and trusted to the ground, and had, in the end, come in. Thank you for staying until the end. If Dorothea's story moved you, leave a thought in the comments, and do not miss what is coming next.